Hi everyone, this is Miss Lenorovitz, and this presentation is going to be about population ecology. Ecology, of course, is the study of how organisms interact with their physical environment. So when we're talking about population ecology, we're thinking about the factors that cause populations to increase or decrease depending on how they're interacting with their environment. So we've defined ecology. Let's take a moment to define population. So a population are the individuals that belong to the same species that live in a given area at a particular time. So for example, we have a population of penguins living here in this location in Antarctica. The fact that they are there at the same time means that they have the opportunity to interbreed with each other to produce offspring. Populations are not always contiguous, however, so we may have individuals from the same species living in 4 distinct segments as depicted on the right, a metapopulation. And depending on how robust and integral those corridors are, population A may or may not integrate and populate and breed with population B, C, and D. So they may operate as separate populations or one larger population. So why is knowing about populations helpful? Well, from a human perspective, it helps with making sense of things like taxes, what taxes to charge, how much money is going to come in for a particular budget. It matters for areas of health insurance and planning. It matters in terms of influencing how much houses cost and how many new houses are needed in terms of real estate. And it matters in terms of politics and economy. Where we're going to focus in this presentation is on wildlife. We oftentimes call it wildlife management, but oftentimes what we're referring to is managing humans so that wildlife can continue to coexist with our burgeoning population. There are a couple of helpful terms and characteristics to think about when we're considering a population. The first is population size. And in population ecology, we often use a capital letter N to indicate population size. So here we're thinking simply about the number of individuals that live within a particular area or volume at a given time. We might consider volume if we're thinking about aquatic or marine organisms. Similarly, we want to know about a population's density. So how closely packed together or spread apart are those individuals within a population? We also want to think about population distribution. Are those individuals equally spread throughout the entire habitat, or are they clusters or clumped in different areas? It's important for us to also think about the sex ratio. So how many biological males are there compared to biological females? That helps us to understand what the reproductive population might be within a population. And then, of course, there's the age structure of a population. It's helpful to know how many individuals fit in each age category, whether they're in reproductive age, before reproductive age, or post-reproductive age. So let's think about each of those characteristics a little bit more. In terms of population distribution, there are really 3 different categories that a population can fit into. They can be randomly distributed, so individuals can be randomly located as these cattle are across this pasture, meaning that they're scattered or distributed in an uneven way. So for example, if we went into this pasture and we only sampled the population in the lower right-hand corner here, we might come up with a much higher population estimate than if we were sampling in the northwestern corner of that segment. If a population is uniform, that means the distribution is even. It means we can more easily then, as ecologists, subsample an area and come up with a good estimation of population size. And a population can also be clumped, so distributed in clusters, much like the representation of the human population in North America here, shown at nighttime, and you can see by the intensity of the lights where the population is most densely located. We also want to consider the population's sex ratio. This is going to help us determine a really good understanding of what the future population might be. You need to have a knowable ratio of biological males to females to understand whether the current population is going to be able to reproduce and sustain its size, to increase in size, or maybe facing a decline in size. With very few exceptions, and there are 2 represented here, the whiptail lizards, which are all biologically female, or the clownfish, which start off all biologically male, most populations of most organisms typically have a 50-50 ratio of males to females. And when we start to see a shift in that 50-50 ratio within most species, that means we have to do some different thinking in terms of projecting the population size moving forward. We also want to give consideration to a population's age structure. On the left-hand side here, we're looking at population pyramids representing the age structure of 3 different populations in Nigeria, the United States, and in Germany. And we can tell simply by looking at that distribution of males and females in different age brackets that, for example, the population in Nigeria over the next several decades is going to continue to grow. And that's because you have a fairly large number of people who are in their reproductive years and a very large portion of the population that is in their pre-reproductive years. So as that population moves forward in time, there are going to be many, many more people in that population. In contrast, looking at the United States population pyramid, we can see that we have a smaller number of individuals that are in that reproductive age compared to older generations, and we can see that that's a fairly steady number moving forward. In contrast to that, we can look at Germany, where there's a decline in human population, because we can see at those younger cohorts that there is a decline in the number of individuals there. That matters as well in the natural environment too for organisms other than humans. For example, in this forest depicted on the left-hand side here, we have a variety of ages. We also have a variety of organisms. So that's an uneven age forest, which means decades from now, we're probably still going to see a mix of older trees and younger trees. However, in the even age forest that's represented on the right-hand side here, which is likely a plantation replanting of a forest, all of those trees, all of those individuals there are the same individual of the same species, and they're exactly the same age. That means that they're all going to hit their reproductive ages at the same time. It also means they're more likely to be susceptible to diseases and to death at around the same time period. That means 2 very different things for these forests moving forward. In addition to those factors we just discussed, we also want to think about how populations grow. Many populations, when there are no limiting factors, will grow in an exponential way. We oftentimes refer to that as a J-shaped curve. So if we're graphing population size versus time, the shape of the curve generally looks like the letter J. In exponential growth, or also known as intrinsic growth, we can estimate the size of the population at any given time based on the current size of the population times the natural log raised to r, which is the rate of intrinsic growth, times the amount of time we want to project over. You know from previous learning that we can roughly estimate the doubling time of a population by taking the number 70 and dividing it by the percentage of the growth rate. If you're interested in finding out more about this, you can go through and solve this equation by solving it for n at time t, where n at t is twice the amount at n at time 0. And you will find that you will get a ratio of about 0.7. So that's where that value comes from. Again, exponential growth typically happens when there are ideal growing conditions without very many limiting resources. That can happen for a while, but most populations will reach or achieve what's called logistic growth over time. Here, we often refer to this as an S-shaped curve. Again, if we look at population size over time, we can see that overall the shape of this curve looks roughly like the letter S. The red zone here is representing the early initial exponential growth, but as a population starts to run out of limiting resources or end up with competition for them, the rate of growth declines until that population reaches carrying capacity. So that growth levels off on the carrying capacity or the long-term rate that's sustainable by the environment and the conditions. So the factors that can influence a population size could be characterized as density dependent or density independent. Density dependent limiting factors and limiting resources are things that become more limiting the larger the size of the population. So for example, access to food, competition for food, or diseases are density dependent factors, whereas density independent factors may be things like catastrophes like earthquakes or hurricanes or high winds or volcanoes. Here you're looking at a forest that was significantly impacted because it was a dense population affected by wind. There are certain types of environmental issues like forest fires, which could be considered both density independent. A lightning bolt could strike at any time in any forest, but they are also density dependent because the more closely packed the trees are, if one tree is impacted by fire, it's very likely to impact the others as well. Population size is also impacted by reproduction strategies. So we typically categorize organisms as either R-selected species, those that make a lot of babies or a lot of offspring, hoping that few will make it through to adulthood. That R refers to the R that we looked at before in the equation representing the R for intrinsic growth. Examples of that would be sea turtles, which lay quite a few eggs on the beach and leave them there hoping that some of the young will make it through to survive to go into the ocean and to adulthood, and dandelions, which produce an enormous number of seeds, hoping that at least one or two might germinate and survive into adulthood. In contrast, we have K-selected species. These are organisms whose strategy is to make few offspring and put a lot of energy and time into nurturing them. The K here refers to the K in carrying capacity that we looked at previously at this graph. Whales and humans are good examples that use that strategy. We often categorize R and K selected species into three different types based on survivorship. So type 1 organisms oftentimes are K selected, where you have a lot of individuals surviving for a fairly long time, and then many individuals dying off as they reach the maximum lifespan for that organism. Type 3 organisms, in contrast, their survivorship curve looks like this. Many organisms perish, but some, a very small number, will make it all the way to their ultimate lifespan. And then there are type 2 organisms, which use strategies that are in between. They have a constant survival and death rate throughout their entire lifespan. On the right-hand side, you will see a scale here of examples of organisms that are on the R-selected versus K-selected end of the spectrum. We know we care about population size, but how do you measure it? There are a couple of different strategies. If you have a population, like this population of plant species here, that doesn't move around a lot and has an even distribution, you can use what's called the quadrat method, in which case you take a grid, something like this, and you count the number of individuals in that grid, and then you lift that grid up and you repeat it in several different parts of the habitat in which you're measuring that organism. You then take an overall average of the number of individuals in the area of that grid and you apply it to the larger habitat. Not all species are stable and in one location, and not all species are evenly distributed. So in that case, you might need to rely on the indirect method. Here, ecologists would estimate population based on tracks, nests, burrows, etc. And it's a really good strategy if the population moves around a lot or is not easily visible. The snow leopard is a good example. It lives in the Himalayas at high elevations, very rugged terrain. It's an apex predator, so its habitat for each individual organism is huge, and so humans don't often directly see it. So ecologists rely on indirect methods like scat piles in order to estimate the population size. This is also useful if you have organisms that have a very short lifespan, like the LDD, formerly known as the gypsy moth, where the egg, larva, pupa, and adult cycle happen really quickly. In order to estimate the population size of an organism like that, ecologists actually use egg masses and that way are able to estimate the population of the size next year. The final method this video will discuss is called the mark and recapture method. This is really good for populations that do move around a lot. A great example of this is the monarch butterfly, which is an adult that migrates all from North America all the way down to Central America during its annual cycle. In this case, you catch, mark, and release individuals, and on the second catch, you count how many have been recaptured. Here, you rely on a ratio of the number of marked individuals divided by the size of the overall population, that its ratio is going to be similar to the number of marked individuals that are recaptured divided by the number of marked individuals in your second sample. So we can solve for population size by taking the marked individuals times the size of the second sample divided by the number that are recaptured. Hopefully that helps you think about populations in a different